In 2010, two economists at Harvard published a finding that there is a line a country crosses, a single ratio of debt to the size of its economy, and once a nation crosses it, growth collapses, 90%. That was the number. And within months it was being read into the record by politicians in Washington and finance ministers in Brussels as the scientific justification for cutting spending across entire continents. Schools, pensions, hospitals, jobs, austerity for hundreds of millions of people, defended by pointing at one number in one paper. 3 years later, a graduate student in Massachusetts was assigned to reproduce that paper for a class. He could not do it. So he asked the authors for their original spreadsheet, and when it arrived, he found that a formula had skipped 5 rows. 5 countries left out of the average by accident. When you put them back in, the cliff disappeared. The number that justified a decade of austerity was, in part, an error in Excel. That should have been the end of it. It was not. Because the deeper thing the paper got at did not go away when the spreadsheet got fixed, and that is the part almost nobody followed all the way down. There is no magic line. But there is a trap, and right now, in 2026, the United States, France, Britain and Japan are all somewhere inside it, walking toward the same narrowing room where every door out is one nobody wants to open. So get comfortable and subscribe or join if you haven't, because there's a deeper version of this story on the Patreon where we follow these collapses across history, the empires and currencies and quiet defaults that all rhyme with this one. Stay with me to the end, because the most unsettling thing here is not the debt itself. It is what happens to a country's choices once the interest bill gets too big to ignore. Let's start where it started. Somewhere on a laptop at Harvard, in a spreadsheet, a formula was told to take the average of a column of numbers. It was given the wrong range. It reached down through the rows of data and it stopped 5 rows short. 5 countries fell out of the calculation. Australia, Austria, Belgium, Canada, Denmark. Not deleted, not argued over, not flagged. Just quietly dropped out of the average because a cell reference ended in the wrong place. And on the strength of the number that came out of that broken formula, governments across the developed world spent the better part of a decade cutting schools, cutting hospitals, cutting pensions, cutting the wages of nurses and teachers and the people who empty the bins. Hundreds of millions of lives bent around a number, and the number had a hole in it. That is not a metaphor. That is not me reaching for an image. There was an actual spreadsheet with an actual coding error, and the error sat undetected for 3 years while the great finance ministries of the developed world quoted the result of it as if it were a law of nature. When the error was finally found, it was found by a graduate student who had been handed the file as a homework assignment. He was not trying to bring down a theory, he was trying to pass a class. He could not get the numbers to work, so he asked the authors for the original spreadsheet, and they sent it to him, and he opened it, and there it was. A line of arithmetic that had quietly governed the lives of more people than most wars. I want to be careful here, because the spreadsheet is the part everyone remembers, and the spreadsheet is not actually the disturbing part. The spreadsheet is the door. What is behind the door is much worse, and almost nobody walked through it. Because once the error was found, everyone was so busy laughing at the mistake that they stopped reading. They thought the story was over. They thought the number was wrong, the threshold was fake, we can all relax now. And that is exactly the moment the real trap closed, because the thing the broken formula was pointing at did not go away when the formula got fixed. It is still there. It is sitting in the public accounts of the United States, of France, of Britain, of Japan, right now as you listen to this, and the math that describes it does not care that one paper got the decimal point wrong. So here is the claim, and I am going to spend the next 2.5 hours showing you that it is true, and showing you exactly where it stops being true, because the place where it stops being true is more frightening than the claim itself. The claim is that there is a line, a ratio between what a country owes and the size of everything the country produces in a year. And the story that was sold to you, in the rare event anyone bothered to tell you anything at all, is that crossing this line is like crossing a cliff edge. One side, you are fine. Other side, you fall. That is the version that fit on a slide in a budget committee. That is the version a politician could point at. It is wrong. The cliff does not exist. There is no single number where a healthy country steps over a line and dies. That part really was an error, and not just an error in one spreadsheet, but an error in how the whole thing was framed. And yet every serious person who has studied the long history of national debt keeps arriving at the same uncomfortable place. Not a cliff. A trap. The difference matters more than any single statistic in this entire story, so hold on to it. A cliff is a line you cross. A trap is a room you walk into, slowly, often without noticing. And the defining feature of the room is not the moment you enter it. The defining feature is that once you are far enough inside, every door out leads somewhere you do not want to go. You can leave. You can always leave. That was never the problem. The problem is what it costs to leave, and who pays, and the fact that by the time you are looking for the exit, the choice is no longer between a good option and a bad one. The choice is between 3 bad ones, and you do not get to pick a 4th, because the 4th one was spent years ago, quietly, while everyone was still saying that this time was different. That phrase is going to come back. This time is different. Remember it. It is the most expensive sentence in the history of money, and it has been said in roughly the same words before every single one of these collapses by people who were just as intelligent as the people saying it now. Here is the part I need you to sit with before we go any further, because it is the shape of everything that follows. When a country is deep enough inside this room, it stops being governed by its parliament and starts being governed by its interest bill. Not in a dramatic way. There is no coup. The flag stays up. The elections still happen. But the budget, the real budget, the actual decisions about what the country can and cannot afford to do, gets handed over to a creditor that does not vote, does not sleep, does not forgive, and never forgets a single thing you have ever borrowed. And the way that creditor eventually gets paid, in almost every case in recorded history, is by reaching into the savings, the pensions, and the wages of ordinary people who were never told they were the collateral. People like you. You are the part of this story that the slide in the budget committee left out. You always were. Now let me show you where this number came from, because it did not come from a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet was the last and smallest chapter. The number came from 8 centuries of wreckage, and from 2 economists who spent years walking through that wreckage counting the bodies, and one of them learned to count the way she did because of something that happened to her when she was 10 years old. In 1966, a 10-year-old girl named Carmen Castellanos left Havana with her parents and 3 suitcases. The family was allowed to take almost nothing. Cuba was closing, and the people leaving were leaving for good, and what you could carry was what you would have. Her father, who had run a small business, and her mother, sat the child down and told her something that she has repeated in interviews for the rest of her life. They told her that money can be taken, property can be seized, a house can be left behind and never seen again, but education is the one thing you take with you, because it lives inside you, and no government and no border guard can confiscate it. She was a refugee. She has used that exact word about herself, and she grew up to become one of the 2 or 3 people on earth who understood most precisely how the savings of an entire nation can vanish overnight, which is a strange and fitting thing for someone whose family learned that lesson the hard way before she had finished primary school. Carmen Reinhart, as she became after she married, did not set out to be an economist. She wanted to study fashion design. She enrolled in fashion merchandising and she hated it, and she switched to economics almost by accident, and she turned out to have a mind that worked in a way most economists do not. The field she walked into was dominated by theory, beautiful equations describing how rational agents ought to behave in idealized markets. Reinhart was not interested in how things ought to behave. She was interested in what actually happened, in the real world, with real money, over and over again across centuries. One of her former professors, the economist Guillermo Calvo, said she did not fit the mould of the typical academic economist, and he did not mean it entirely as a compliment, and she has worn it as one ever since. She described her own method, years later, by reaching for Sherlock Holmes. The game is afoot. She was a detective. The crime she spent her life investigating was the same crime, committed again and again, by nations that should have known better and always believed they were the exception. Her partner in this investigation was a man whose biography sounds invented. Kenneth Rogoff was a chess prodigy, not a strong amateur. A prodigy in the technical sense, a child who at 16 dropped out of high school to play chess full-time, who moved to Europe and lived out of tournament winnings, who became an international master and then a grandmaster, the highest title the game offers. He met Bobby Fischer, the most famous and most unstable genius in the history of the game, and Fischer was reportedly impressed by the young Rogoff, by what he called his self-assured style. And then Rogoff did something almost no chess prodigy has ever done. He walked away from it. He looked at a life spent staring at 64 squares and he decided he wanted to stare at something larger. And he went back and finished his education and took a doctorate in economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he eventually became the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, the institution that arrives like a surgeon or an undertaker whenever a country's finances finally fail. A man who had spent his youth learning to see 20 moves ahead, calculating the precise point at which a position becomes lost even though the pieces are all still on the board, even though the player who is losing does not yet know it. Hold that image too, because it is the whole story. A position can be lost long before the king falls. A good player knows the game is over, while his opponent is still planning his attack. That is what a debt trap is. It is a lost position that still looks, to the person inside it, like a game that can be won. In 2009, Reinhart and Rogoff published a book. The title was a quotation, and it was meant as an accusation. They called it "This Time is Different," and the subtitle told you the scope of what they had attempted. 8 centuries of financial folly. They had built a database. This is the part that should make you trust them even when you later watch them get something wrong, because the scale of the work is genuinely staggering. They had assembled the financial records of 66 countries across 5 continents, reaching back roughly 800 years to the defaults of medieval monarchs. They tracked banking crises. They tracked the moments governments stopped paying their foreign debts. They tracked the moments governments stopped paying their own citizens. They tracked currencies collapsing and inflation devouring savings. They took the single most repeated financial event in human history and they did the thing nobody had done at that scale, which was to line up every instance side by side and ask whether there was a pattern. There was a pattern. There were several. And the first one they found is the one that gives the book its title and its quiet fury. Before nearly every major debt crisis, the smartest people in the room explain, with real conviction and real evidence, why the old rules no longer apply to them. The technology is new, the financial instruments are more sophisticated, the central bank is wiser, the economy has changed its fundamental character. We have learned the lessons of the past. This time, they say, is different. And it is, in the surface details, always different. The instruments change, the decade changes, the flag changes. The one thing that does not change is the ending. Reinhart and Rogoff described the engine of it as a dangerous mix of hubris, euphoria, and amnesia. And the amnesia is the cruelest part, because the records exist, the warnings exist, the previous collapse is right there in the history books. People simply decide it does not apply to them, and they are wrong, and the wrongness is so reliable across 800 years that it starts to look less like a series of mistakes and more like a feature of the human animal when it gets near borrowed money. But the finding that should genuinely unsettle you is the one that gets less attention, because it is less flattering and harder to argue with. Reinhart and Rogoff found that defaulting on your national debt is not the exotic disaster of failed states and banana republics that the comfortable version of history pretends it is. They found that serial default is, in their words, a nearly universal phenomenon as countries climb the ladder of development, not a rare catastrophe. A developmental stage, a thing that happens to almost everyone on the way up, and to a surprising number of people who have supposedly already arrived. The countries we think of as the safe ones, the mature ones, the ones whose bonds are treated as the closest thing finance has to a sure thing, are very often countries that defaulted repeatedly in earlier centuries and simply outlived the memory of it. The safety is not a permanent property of the country. It is a phase. And a phase, by definition, ends. And here is where it gets worse. Because the trap I described at the start is already visible in the historical record, hiding inside the dry statistics. Reinhart and Rogoff measured how long these episodes last, and the comfortable assumption is that a debt crisis is a sharp event, a bad year or two, a sudden shock followed by recovery. That is not what the data shows. The data shows that once a country gets into serious trouble with its debt, it does not get out quickly. It does not get out in a year. The shadow lengthens, and it stays. Default spells in the historical record dragged on for years, sometimes decades, and the modern ones are shorter only because the modern world invented faster and quieter ways of taking the money back. We will get to those ways. They have polite names. They are happening to somebody right now, in real time, and most of the people they are happening to have no idea, because nobody told them what to look for. By the time we are done, you will not be able to stop seeing it. So the book lands in 2009 in the wreckage of a global financial crisis, at the exact moment when every government on earth is suddenly, desperately interested in the question of how much debt is too much. The book becomes a sensation. It wins awards. It is translated into more than 20 languages. Finance ministers carry it. And then, the following year, Reinhart and Rogoff publish a short follow-up paper, a quick piece for a conference, not even formally peer-reviewed. And that paper contains a single number, and that single number is about to escape the world of academic economics and go out into the real world and start cutting. The paper was called Growth in a Time of Debt. It came out in 2010 in the Papers and Proceedings of the American Economic Review, which is the printed record of a big annual conference. I want you to understand what that means, because it matters enormously, and almost nobody who quoted this paper seemed to know it or care. The papers in that particular issue are not subjected to the full, brutal peer review process that a normal economics paper goes through, where anonymous experts try to tear it apart before it is allowed to exist. These are conference pieces, shorter, quicker, less scrutinized by design. The single most influential empirical claim in the politics of the decade that followed lived in a document that had never been through the front door of scientific scrutiny. It went out the side door, and the world treated it like scripture. The claim was this: Reinhart and Rogoff looked at the relationship between how much a government owed, measured against the size of its economy, and how fast that economy grew, and they reported that below a certain level of debt, the relationship was weak. Debt went up, growth was more or less fine. But above a threshold of 90% of the size of the economy, something changed. Above 90%, they wrote, median growth rates fall by 1%, and average growth falls considerably more. And then came the number that did all the damage. For the subset of wealthy advanced economies in the years after the Second World War, when they sorted those countries into buckets by how much debt they carried, the average growth rate of the highest debt bucket, the countries above 90%, was reported as negative 0.1%. Below zero. Not slow growth. Not weak growth. Shrinkage. The economy going backwards. That is the number. Negative 0.1%. Sit with how clean it is, how usable, how perfectly shaped for a politician's mouth. It says, in effect, that once a country's debt crosses 90% of its economy, the economy stops growing and starts to die. It draws the cliff. It puts a bright red line on the floor and it says, do not cross this, and if you have already crossed it, get back behind it as fast as you possibly can, no matter what it costs, because what is on this side is death. Paul Krugman, the Nobel laureate, later wrote that Reinhart and Rogoff may have had more immediate influence on public debate than any previous paper in the history of economics. I think he was right, and I think the word immediate is doing a great deal of quiet work in that sentence, because the influence was immediate in a way that careful science almost never is. There was no waiting for replication, no years of argument. The timing was perfect and the timing was everything. The world had just borrowed colossal amounts of money to stop the financial system from collapsing in 2008, and now every government was staring at a mountain of new debt and a frightened public and a simple, terrifying question. Have we gone too far? And here came two of the most respected economists alive, armed with 8 centuries of data, holding a number that answered the question with the force of arithmetic. 90%. You have gone too far at 90%. In the United States, the Congressman Paul Ryan, who was building the Republican budget and building his own reputation as the party's intellectual on fiscal matters, reached for the paper directly. In his budget document, he wrote that a well-known study completed by economists Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart confirms this common-sense conclusion, and he described the study as having found conclusive empirical evidence that gross debt exceeding 90% of the economy has a significant negative effect on economic growth. Conclusive empirical evidence. Those are the words of a man holding what he believes is a law of physics. Not a contested finding from a non-reviewed conference paper, but a confirmed conclusive fact, suitable for justifying the reshaping of the federal budget of the largest economy on the planet. Across the Atlantic, it was worse, because across the Atlantic they did not just cite it. They acted on it, at continental scale, on populations that had no way to refuse. Olli Rehn was the European Commissioner for Economic and Monetary Affairs, which made him one of the principal architects of the austerity that was about to be imposed on the southern edge of Europe. Rehn wrote to the finance ministers of the European Union and told them, in plain language, that when public debt levels rise above 90%, they tend to have a negative impact on economic dynamism. There is the number again. 90, there is the cliff again. And there, downstream of that sentence, are the actual human consequences which were not abstract and were not small. In Greece, in Spain, in Portugal, in Ireland, in Italy, governments were instructed to slash spending in the middle of a recession, to fire public workers, to cut pensions, to gut health systems, to raise the age of retirement, all in the name of getting back behind the red line before the economy died at 90%. George Osborne, the British Chancellor, built an entire political identity around the same logic. Rogoff himself co-signed a public letter endorsing the British austerity programme. The number was not sitting quietly in a journal. The number was out in the world, and it was hungry, and it was being fed. I need to stop here and make sure the weight of this lands properly, because it is easy to talk about austerity as a policy, as a line on a chart, as a debate between economists, and lose the thing underneath it. Austerity is not a number. Austerity is a cancer ward with fewer nurses. It is a school with a leaking roof that does not get fixed. It is a young person who finishes university into an economy with no jobs and stays unemployed for so long that the unemployment becomes permanent, a scar that follows them for the rest of their working life. In the countries where this was imposed most severely, the human damage was measurable and it was generational. Youth unemployment in Greece and Spain rose above 50%. More than half of an entire generation of young people locked out of work at the most important moment of their economic lives, in part because of a conviction that the economy would die if debt stayed above a line that, it would later turn out, was not actually a line at all. Because here is what was happening in the background, while the number was out doing its work. The number was wrong. Not wrong in the sense that reasonable people could disagree about its interpretation. Wrong in the sense that it had been calculated incorrectly. And the people who calculated it did not know. And the people who were quoting it as conclusive empirical evidence had never checked. Because checking would have meant getting the original spreadsheet and trying to reproduce the result. And almost nobody in economics ever does that. It is one of the quiet scandals of the field. Results get cited thousands of times and almost never independently rebuilt from the raw data. Because there is no glory in replication and no funding for it, and no journal eager to publish you confirming that someone else was right. So a result can be wrong for years, decades even, and nobody notices, because nobody is looking, because looking is somebody else's job, and it is nobody's job. And then, in 2013, somebody looked. Not a senior economist. Not a rival trying to take Reinhart and Rogoff down. A graduate student at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, a young man named Thomas Herndon, who had been given an assignment that sounds almost quaint. Take a famous published paper, get its data, reproduce its result. It is a teaching exercise. It is meant to teach you humility and rigour and the mechanics of how empirical work is actually done. It is not meant to detonate. Herndon chose growth in a time of debt, because it was famous, because it mattered, because the number was everywhere, and he sat down to do what should have been a routine piece of homework, and he could not do it. He ran the numbers, and he did not get negative 0.1%. He got something else. He tried again. He still could not get their result. And at this point, most students would assume they had made a mistake, because the alternative, that two of the most famous economists in the world had made the mistake in the most cited paper of the decade, is almost too arrogant to consider. Herndon considered it anyway. He emailed Carmen Reinhart and asked for the original spreadsheet. She sent it. This is, to her credit, a thing worth pausing on. She did not have to. Many economists guard their data like a state secret, precisely because they are afraid of exactly what was about to happen. Reinhart sent a graduate student the actual working file, and that act of openness is the reason we know what we know, and it is the reason her own most famous result fell apart in public. There is something almost tragic in it. The honesty is what exposed the error. Herndon opened the file, and he started going through it line by line, cell by cell, and he found 3 things. The first is the one that became famous, the one that launched 1,000 jokes, the one I described at the very beginning. There was a formula that was supposed to average the growth rates of the countries in the high debt category. And the formula's range was wrong. Instead of reaching all the way down through the relevant rows, it stopped early. It averaged 15 countries when it should have averaged 20. 5 countries were silently excluded: Australia, Austria, Belgium, Canada, and Denmark, simply not included in the calculation, not for any reason, not as a deliberate choice, but because the little blue box that defines which cells get averaged had been dragged to the wrong place. And those 5 excluded countries happened to be ones that had carried high debt and grown perfectly well anyway. Leaving them out dragged the average down. Putting them back pulls it up. That alone would be embarrassing. But it was the smallest of the 3 problems, and the other 2 were arguably worse, because the other 2 were not slips of the mouse. The second problem was the exclusion of data that did not appear to be a coding accident at all. Certain country years were left out of the analysis. New Zealand is the example everyone uses, and it is a brutal one. New Zealand had several years in the late 1940s when it carried very high debt, and in those years its economy grew. In one year by more than 10%, in another by nearly 12%. Those years were not in the calculation. What remained to represent New Zealand at high debt was a single year, a year in which the economy had shrunk by more than 7%. So an entire country's experience of carrying high debt, which on the full record was a story of strong growth, was reduced to one bad year, and that one bad year stood in for all of it. The third problem was a choice about weighting, a technical decision about how much each country's experience should count, that happened to push the result in the same direction as the other 2. Every error, every choice, every accident, all leaning the same way, all making high debt look more deadly than the underlying data actually said it was. So Herndon, with his 2 advisors, the economists Michael Ash and Robert Pollin, corrected all 3. They put the 5 missing countries back, they restored the excluded years, they used a more conventional weighting, and they recalculated the average growth rate for wealthy countries carrying debt above 90% of their economies. The figure that Reinhart and Rogoff had published, the figure that Paul Ryan had called conclusive empirical evidence, the figure that Olli Rehn had cited to the finance ministers of Europe, the figure that had helped justify firing nurses and cutting pensions across an entire continent, was negative 0.1%. Shrinkage death, the corrected figure, was positive 2.2%. Not shrinkage, not death. Growth, slower growth than low-debt countries, enjoyed yes a real and measurable drag, but growth, ordinary positive growth, the economy moving forward, not falling off any cliff at all. Let me put those 2 numbers next to each other one more time, because the distance between them is the distance between a policy and a catastrophe. Negative 0.1. Positive 2.2. The published number said the patient was dying. The corrected number said the patient was walking around, a little slower than before, but alive and getting on with things. And the entire architecture of austerity, the firings, the cuts, the closed wards, the locked-out generation, had been built on the first number, the dead one, the wrong one. When this broke, in April of 2013, it broke everywhere. It was not confined to economics journals. It was on the news. It was a scandal with a perfect shape, because it had a villain that everyone could understand. Not a complicated econometric dispute about causal identification. a spreadsheet error, an Excel mistake, the kind of mistake that everyone who has ever used a spreadsheet has made, dragging a formula to the wrong cell, and here it was at the heart of the most consequential economic paper of the decade. The comedians had it, the late-night shows had it, there was a savage joy in it, the spectacle of two Harvard economists brought down by the same software blunder that ruins ordinary people's tax returns. And that savage joy, that perfect satisfying shape, is exactly how the real story got buried, because once the world had its villain and its punchline, it stopped paying attention. The narrative became simple. Reinhart and Rogoff were wrong, the 90% threshold was fake, austerity was based on a mistake, the end. Everyone went home feeling that justice had been done and a lie had been exposed. The correction got a fraction of the airtime the original number had received, which is always how it goes, because the truth is more boring than the lie and arrives too late to undo the damage. The austerity had already happened, the wards had already closed, the generation had already been locked out. You cannot unfire a nurse retroactively because a spreadsheet got corrected 3 years later. The number did its work, and then the number died, and the work remained. But I told you the spreadsheet was the door and not the room, and here is where we walk through it. Because the simple satisfying narrative, austerity was based on a mistake, the end, is itself a kind of lie, a comforting one. And comforting lies are the ones you should trust least, especially when they let everyone stop thinking. Watch what Reinhart and Rogoff actually conceded, and watch, more carefully, what they did not. They conceded the coding error instantly and completely. Their response said that Herndon, Ash and Pollen accurately point out the coding error that omits several countries full stop, and they wrote that the critics were, in their words, on point. That is not the response of people trying to bury a fraud. That is the response of people who made a genuine mistake and were caught, and said so. But then they defended the core of their work, and their defense is the thing you need to understand, because their defense was largely correct, and the fact that it was correct is the most uncomfortable part of this entire story. They pointed out something that the punchline obscured. Even with every error fixed, even with the 5 countries restored, and the missing years put back and the weighting changed, the corrected data still showed that high-debt countries grew more slowly than low-debt countries. The cliff was gone. The dramatic negative number was gone. But the basic association did not vanish. High debt still went with slower growth. 2.2% is real growth, but it is slower growth, and the countries with low debt in the same period grew at well over 3%. There was still a gap. There was still a drag. The fixed data did not say that debt does not matter. It said that debt does not kill you at a specific line. Those are extremely different statements, and the world, in its hurry to enjoy the spreadsheet joke, heard the second one and acted as though it had heard the first. And there was a second defence, quieter than the first, that almost nobody reported, and it is the one that should keep you up at night. A year before the spreadsheet scandal, Reinhart and Rogoff, working with Vincent Reinhart, had published a more careful piece of work in a properly reviewed journal, looking specifically at what they called public debt overhangs. They defined an overhang as a period when a country's debt stayed above 90% of its economy, not for a year, not for 2, but for at least 5 years running. A sustained condition, not a momentary spike. And they went looking for every such episode in the advanced economies going back to 1800. They found 26 of them. And when they measured what happened during those episodes, they found that growth ran lower by something over 1 percentage point a year, which sounds survivable, which sounds almost trivial, until you hear the second number. These overhang episodes lasted, on average, about 23 years, 23 years. 20 of the 26 episodes lasted more than a decade. This is the finding that survived the spreadsheet. This is the finding that the punchline buried. Because a 1% reduction in growth for a single year is nothing. It is noise. You would never feel it. But a 1% reduction in growth every year for 23 years is a different animal entirely. It compounds. It is a slow, grinding subtraction that runs for an entire generation, and over that span the gap between where the country is and where it would have been if it had grown normally becomes enormous. It is the difference between the life your children get and the life they would have had. Rogoff put it bluntly when he defended the work. He said it is utterly misleading to speak of a 1% growth differential that lasts 10 to 25 years as small. And he was right. That is the trap beginning to show its shape. Not a cliff you fall off in a single dramatic moment. A long, quiet, decades-long erosion that you cannot feel happening and cannot easily reverse, because by the time it is obvious, 20 years have passed and the compounding has already done its work. So we have arrived at the genuinely difficult part, the part where I cannot give you the clean answer, because the clean answer does not exist, and anyone who offers you one is selling you something. Here is what the honest state of the evidence actually is, and I am going to give it to you straight, even though it is less satisfying than either the cliff or the punchline. The cliff is dead. There is no magic number. The single most important follow-up came from inside the International Monetary Fund itself, the very institution that had used the 90% logic to impose austerity. In 2014, a group of the fund's own economists, led by Andrea Pescatori, published a paper with a title that reads like a quiet apology. Debt and Growth. Is there a magic threshold? And their answer was no. They wrote that there is no simple threshold above which debt ratios severely undermine medium-term growth prospects. They could not find the line. They looked, with better methods and more data, and the line was not there. The cliff at 90%, or at any other specific number, was an illusion created by the way the data had been sliced. The most rigorous review of the entire field since a vast statistical study by the economist Philip Heimberger that pulled more than 800 separate estimates from dozens of studies, reached a similar place. There is a relationship between high debt and lower growth, but it is modest. It is not a cliff, and after you correct for the way academic publishing favours dramatic findings over boring ones, you cannot even confidently rule out that the true effect is close to zero. Different studies that go looking for a threshold find it in completely different places. Anywhere from 30% to over 115%, which is the statistical signature of a thing that is not really there. If the line were real, everyone would find it in the same place. They do not, so it is not a line. And it gets more uncomfortable, because there is a problem underneath the threshold problem, a problem about cause and effect that is genuinely unresolved, and that I find more disturbing the longer I think about it. The whole austerity argument assumed a direction. It assumed that high debt causes slow growth. Debt goes up, the weight of it drags the economy down, growth falls. But the arrow might run the other way, and it almost certainly runs the other way at least part of the time. When an economy slows down, when a recession hits, tax revenue collapses, and the government has to spend more on unemployment and support, so the debt rises. And the size of the economy, the thing you are measuring the debt against, shrinks, so the ratio shoots up, not because debt caused the slowdown, but because the slowdown caused the debt. Slow growth produces high debt at least as readily as high debt produces slow growth. They feed each other. And once you accept that the causation runs in both directions, the original policy prescription starts to look not just wrong, but backwards. Because cutting spending in the middle of a downturn in the name of reducing debt can deepen the downturn, which shrinks the economy further, which raises the very ratio you were trying to lower. Some of the countries that swallowed the most austerity watched their debt ratios climb anyway, because the medicine was making the patient sicker, which was driving up the number the medicine was supposed to bring down. So if you have been waiting for me to tell you that the debt trap is a myth, that the whole thing was a spreadsheet error and a confusion about cause and effect, that you can relax, here is the moment I take it away from you. Because the opposite is true, and the reason it is true is the most important idea in this entire story. The death of the magic number does not free us from the trap. It changes what the trap is. The trap was never the ratio. The ratio was always a distraction, a single number that everyone fought over because a single number is easy to fight over. The real trap is something the number was only ever a crude proxy for, and it has a name, even if the name is not catchy enough to put on a slide. The name is the loss of optionality, the collapse of choices, the disappearance of the room to maneuver. Let me make this concrete, because it is abstract right up until the moment it is the most concrete thing in your life. A country with low debt has options. When a crisis hits, a pandemic, a war, a banking collapse, a natural disaster, it can borrow, it can spend, it can cushion its people from the blow, run a big deficit for a few years, and grow its way back out. The debt is not a cage, it is a tool, and the country can reach for it when it needs it. That capacity, the ability to respond to a disaster by borrowing against the future, is one of the most valuable things a nation can possess, and you never see it, because it is invisible until the day you need it. It is like the structural strength of a bridge. You do not notice it every day. You notice it the one day a truck too heavy for it drives across. A country deep in debt has spent that capacity. It used the bridge's strength up in the good times, or in the last crisis, or servicing the debt from the crisis before that, and now the crisis arrives and there is nothing left to reach for. It cannot borrow to cushion the blow. Because the markets that lend it money are already nervous about how much it owes, and if it tries to borrow much more, they will demand punishing interest rates, or refuse to lend at all. So when the disaster comes, and disasters always come, the heavily indebted country has to face it with no shock absorbers. It has to cut into the wound rather than bandage it. And this is the thing the ratio was always pointing at and never quite captured. The danger of high debt is not that some specific percentage poisons the economy. The danger is that high debt quietly confiscates your ability to deal with the future, and you do not find out it has been confiscated until the future arrives and you reach for the tool that is no longer there. And here is the second time I am going to ask you to look directly at where all of this is heading, because we are about halfway down now, and I promised you, the bottom is worse than the top. The loss of optionality does not stop at the level of the nation. It passes through. When a government runs out of room, when it can no longer borrow, and can no longer grow fast enough, and can no longer cut any further without the cutting becoming politically fatal, it does not simply give up. It reaches for the options that remain, and the options that remain are the ones that do not require anyone's permission. There is a set of exits from a debt trap that a government can take without a vote, without an announcement, without ever once saying out loud what it is doing. They work precisely because they are quiet, because the people they take the money from never quite realize the money is being taken, or realize it only years later when it is gone. The quietest of these exits is aimed directly at people who did everything right. Savers, the careful, the people with a pension and a bank account and a sensible aversion to risk. The trap, when it finally closes on them first, and it closes so softly that most of them die without ever knowing it was the government's hand in their pocket. I am going to show you exactly how that works, but to understand it, You have to understand the full menu of exits, all of them, and you have to understand why past a certain point, every single item on the menu is something nobody would ever choose if they had a choice. Start with the engine that drives a country into the room in the first place, because it is mechanical and it is merciless and it is operating right now in the largest economy on earth. The engine is interest. When a government borrows, it pays interest on what it owes, and that interest is money that has to come out of the budget before anything else gets funded. It is not optional. You can defund a program. You can close a department. You cannot skip an interest payment, because the day you skip an interest payment is the day you have defaulted, and the markets that lend you money will remember it for a generation. So interest sits at the front of the queue, and everything else, every road, every school, every soldier, every pension, every hospital, gets funded out of what is left after the interest is paid. Now watch what happens as the debt grows and the interest with it. In the financial year that just ended, the United States government spent $970 billion on interest payments alone. Not on anything. Not a road built, not a child taught, not a missile made, not a pension paid. $970 billion purely to service what was already owed, a rise of nearly 10% in a single year. To give that number a shape, it works out to roughly $7,300 for every household in the country, taken in taxes and handed straight to the holders of government debt, in exchange for nothing new at all. It is now the third largest thing the federal government does, behind only the great social insurance programs, Social Security and Medicare. And here is the line that should stop you cold. In that same year, interest payments exceeded the entire military budget. The United States now spends more servicing its debt than it spends on the most expensive armed forces in the history of the world. The country that outspends the next 9 nations combined on its military now spends more than that on interest. The Congressional Budget Office, which is the non-partisan body that does this arithmetic for the government, projects that this gap only widens. From here forward, by their own numbers, interest costs stay higher than defense spending every single year, and as a share of the economy, interest is heading to a level not seen since at least 1940, which is to say not seen since the country was funding a world war. This is the engine of the trap, and you can see why it is a trap and not a cliff. Every dollar that goes to interest is a dollar that cannot go to anything that grows the economy or serves the public, which means the government has to borrow more to do the things it still needs to do, which means the debt rises, which means next year's interest bill is larger, which means even more of the budget is eaten before anyone gets to decide anything. It feeds on itself. And crucially, it gets dramatically worse when interest rates rise, because a country with an enormous pile of debt is exquisitely sensitive to the rate it pays. For years, the rich world borrowed at rates near zero, and the trap stayed hidden because even a vast debt costs little to service when the interest rate is almost nothing. That era is over. Rates rose. And now the bill is coming due on debt that was taken on in the cheap years, and it is being refinanced at the expensive rates, and the interest line is exploding across the developed world all at once. This is why the question has come roaring back now, in our moment, when everyone thought the spreadsheet joke had settled it years ago. The arithmetic never cared about the joke. So that is how a country walks into the room. Now here are the doors out, and I want you to notice as we go through them that there are only a few, that humanity has been trying to escape this room for 800 years and has never once invented a fifth door, and that every door has a price, and the price is always paid by people who were not consulted. The first door is the most violent and the most famous, and it is inflation. A government that owes vast amounts of money in its own currency has a terrible power available to it. it can create more of that currency. And if it creates enough, the value of each unit of currency falls, prices rise, and crucially, the real value of the debt falls with it, because the debt is a fixed number of currency units, and if each unit is worth less, the burden of the whole pile shrinks. You can, quite literally, inflate your debt away. You borrowed a mountain of money when the money was worth something, and you pay it back in money that is worth a fraction of what it was, and the difference is quietly transferred from the people who lent you the money to you. It works. It has always worked. And the reason it is a door nobody wants to open is that the same process that dissolves the debt also dissolves the savings of every person in the country, because their savings are denominated in the same currency that is being destroyed. The horror story here is Weimar Germany, and it is a horror story for a reason. After the First World War, Germany was buried under war debt and crushing reparations, and it reached for the printing press, and the thing got away from it completely. By late 1923, the German mark had collapsed so totally that it took trillions of them to buy a single American dollar. People were paid twice a day and ran to spend their wages before the afternoon, because by evening the money would buy less. A lifetime of savings, the careful accumulation of a prudent middle-class family, became enough to buy a loaf of bread. And then, not even that. The debt was gone, dissolved, inflated into nothing. But so was the entire savings base of the German people, and so, it turned out, was a great deal of their faith in the institutions that had let it happen, and we all know. With the cold clarity of hindsight, what grew in the ground that catastrophe left behind, inflation does not just transfer wealth, it radicalizes. It teaches a population that the rules are a lie and that the careful are fools, and a population that has learned that lesson is capable of anything. Most governments do not go to Weimar. Weimar is the extreme, the warning, the thing held up to frighten everyone away from the printing press entirely. But the milder version, a few years of inflation running deliberately hot, high enough to erode the debt, but low enough to avoid total collapse, is one of the most common exits in all of history, and it is gentle enough that most of the people it robs never file a complaint. Because they never quite understand that they have been robbed. Their wages went up. The prices went up more. The gap is the tax, and it is a tax nobody voted for and nobody can see on any statement, and it falls hardest on exactly the people who held their wealth in cash and bonds, which is to say the old, the cautious, and the poor. The second door is the one everyone pictures when they hear the words debt crisis, and it is outright default. The government simply stops paying. It announces that it cannot or will not honour its debts in full, and it forces its creditors to accept less, sometimes far less, than they are owed. This is the nuclear option, the one that makes the front pages. And modern history has a clean and brutal example in Greece. When the scale of the Greek deficit was finally revealed, the true number having been hidden behind years of false accounting, the country was effectively insolvent, and in 2012 it carried out the largest sovereign debt restructuring in history. Private creditors who held Greek bonds were forced to accept losses on the order of 70% of what they were owed. More than 100 billion euros of debt was wiped out in a single stroke, and it still was not enough. The Greek economy had already collapsed by a quarter, a contraction comparable to the American Great Depression, and Greece went on to become the first developed country in history to miss a scheduled repayment to the International Monetary Fund, joining a list that had until then been the preserve of the poorest and most chaotic nations on earth. Default does not wipe the slate clean and let you start again. It detonates inside the economy that defaults, because the government's debt is somebody's pension fund, somebody's bank, somebody's insurance company, and when it evaporates, the damage radiates outward through the entire financial system of the country that thought it was escaping. And if you want to know what it looks like when a country makes default a way of life rather than a single catastrophe, look at Argentina, which is the closest thing economics has to a laboratory for this disease. By the standard reckoning, Argentina has defaulted on its national debt 9 times. 9, 1827, 1890, 1951, 1956, 1982, 1989, 2001, 2014, and 2020. A country that a century ago was among the richest on the planet, richer per person than France or Germany, a country to which immigrants flocked the way they flocked to the United States, has spent the modern era cycling through default after default after default, each one promising to be the last, each one followed by a period in which the leaders insisted that this time the lessons had been learned and the cycle was broken, and each one followed in due course by another. The 2001 default alone was, at the time, the largest in history. Argentina is what serial default looks like from the inside. It is not a single death. It is a chronic condition, a thing the country carries, a recurring fever that breaks and returns and breaks again. And it is the living proof of Reinhart and Rogoff's most unsettling claim that this is not a disease of the poor and the broken, but a thing that can take a wealthy, sophisticated European-descended nation and grind it down across 100 years until the wealth is a memory and the default is simply how things are. But I have saved the most important door for last, the third real exit, because it is the one you have never heard of, and it is the one being used on somebody right now, and it is the one the entire first half of this story was quietly building toward. It is called financial repression, and the name is so dull, so bureaucratic, so perfectly designed to make your eyes slide off it, that I suspect the dullness is part of the point. Financial repression is the quiet door. It is the exit a government takes when it wants to dissolve its debt without the spectacle of inflation and without the disgrace of default, and it works by a mechanism so subtle that most of the people it robs go to their graves, never knowing it happened to them. Here is how it works, and I am going to go slowly because this is the centre of the whole thing. A government in this situation does 2 things at once. First, it holds interest rates down, below the rate of inflation, and keeps them there for years. Second, it arranges, through regulation, through law, through the structure of the financial system itself, that large pools of money have no choice but to hold government debt anyway. Pension funds are required to hold a certain amount of supposedly safe government bonds. Banks are required to hold them. Insurance companies are required to hold them. The money has nowhere else to go. It is captured. And now watch the trap close, because it is beautiful in the way that a snare is beautiful, which is to say it is beautiful only if you are not the animal in it. The captured money is forced to hold bonds that pay, let us say, 2%. Inflation, meanwhile, is running at, let us say, 5%. So every year, the real value of that money, the actual purchasing power of it, falls by about 3%. The saver is losing 3% of their wealth every year, in real terms, while looking at a statement that shows the number going gently up. The number on the page rises, the value of the number falls faster, and the difference, that 3% a year, does not vanish. It is transferred, silently, from the saver to the government, because the government is the one paying 2% on debt that is being eroded by 5% inflation. The gap is the government's gain and the saver's loss, and they are the same gap. The same money moving from one pocket to another, and no law was passed that you could point to, and no default was declared that would make the news, and no Weimar wheelbarrow of cash appeared to warn anyone. It just happens, quietly, year after year, a slow bleed from the careful to the indebted state. This is not a theory. This is documented history, and the two people who documented it most precisely were, of all people, Carmen Reinhart and a colleague named Maria Belen Sprancia in a paper whose title says everything. The Liquidation of Government Debt. Liquidation, they went back and studied how the United States and Britain dealt with the colossal debts they ran up fighting the Second World War. Debts that in Britain's case rose to something approaching 2.5 times the size of the entire economy, higher than anything those countries face today. And the answer was that they did not, for the most part, pay those debts off in any honest sense. They did not run huge surpluses and hand the money back. They repressed them away. For decades after the war, both countries held interest rates artificially low while inflation ran higher, so that anyone holding government bonds, anyone with savings, anyone with a pension, was slowly, quietly, continuously taxed by the gap. Reinhart and Sprancia estimated that this hidden mechanism liquidated debt at a rate of around 3 to 4% of the entire economy every year. 3 to 4% of everything the country produced, transferred annually from savers to the state, for years on end, without a single line of it appearing as a tax, without a single voter being asked to approve it, without most of the population ever understanding that it was happening to them. It is the quietest robbery in the history of the world, and it is quiet by design. And it worked so well that the debt of the Second World War melted away, and the people it melted away from mostly never knew. Now you understand the thing I asked you to hold at the very beginning. You are the part of this story the Budget Committee slide left out. When a country runs out of the loud exits, when it cannot inflate openly without becoming Weimar, and cannot default openly without becoming Greece, it reaches for the quiet one, and the quiet one is aimed at you. Not at the rich, particularly, because the rich hold their wealth in things that float above the repression, in shares, in property, in assets that rise with inflation rather than being eaten by it. It is aimed at the person with a bank account and a pension and a sensible, prudent, lifelong habit of saving. It is aimed at exactly the behaviour that every authority told you was responsible. The trap, when it finally closes hardest on the people who did everything they were told to do. And it closes so softly that they feel nothing, and that is not a flaw in the mechanism. That is the mechanism working perfectly. There is a fourth door, and I include it for honesty, because it is the only one that does not end in someone being robbed, and that is precisely why it is the rarest. You can grow your way out. You can also, in the same breath, cut your way towards solvency through genuine austerity that actually works, and the two often go together, growth plus restraint, the debt staying still while the economy swells around it until the ratio shrinks, not because the debt fell, but because everything else rose. It is the honourable exit. It is the one with no hidden victim. And history offers exactly one truly clean example at scale, and the example is instructive precisely because of how rare and how lucky it was. When the Napoleonic Wars finally ended at Waterloo in 1815, Britain had won, and Britain was buried. The cost of more than 2 decades of near-continuous war against France had driven the British national debt to something over 200% of the entire economy, a level that makes most of today's frightening numbers look modest. Servicing that debt consumed close to 2/5 of all government revenue. 2 out of every £5 the British state collected went straight back out the door to the holders of its debt. By the logic of the cliff, by the logic of the 90% threshold, Britain in 1815 should have been finished, locked into the spiral, doomed to inflation or default or decades of repression. It was not. Over the following century, Britain ground that mountain down, not to 90%, not to 60%, but all the way down to under 30% of the economy by the eve of the First World War. It is the great escape, the proof that the trap can be beaten, and for exactly that reason it is worth understanding precisely why Britain escaped, because the conditions of its escape are a list of everything most countries in the trap do not have. Britain had, first, a very long stretch of relative peace, the better part of a century without another existential war to pay for, which meant it could stop adding to the pile and start working it down. Most countries deep in debt do not get a century of peace handed to them. Britain had, second, the fact that it was the dominant economic power on the planet at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. The workshop of the world, growing richer faster than anyone had ever grown, so that the economy swelled enormously beneath a debt that was held roughly still, and the ratio fell because the denominator exploded. Most countries in the trap are not sitting on top of the single greatest economic transformation in human history. Britain had, third, the credibility to borrow at low rates throughout, because it had never defaulted, because its institutions were trusted, because it issued a peculiar kind of bond, the console, that never had to be repaid at all, but simply paid interest forever, which gave the government enormous flexibility. The escape was real, but the escape required peace, supremacy, growth and trust, all at once, sustained across 100 years, and that combination is so rare that in 8 centuries of records, it is essentially the one clean example we have at that scale. The honourable door exists. It is just locked to almost everyone, because the key to it is a set of advantages that a country in trouble almost never possesses, and the countries that do possess them tend not to be the countries in trouble. Which brings us to the objection you have been waiting to raise, and which I have been waiting to answer, because it is the strongest argument against everything I have told you, and intellectual honesty demands that I give it to you in its full strength, rather than a weakened version I can easily knock down. The objection is one word long, and the word is Japan. Japan breaks the story. Japan has, depending on exactly how you measure it, a national debt of around 230% of its economy, possibly higher, the highest of any major developed nation on Earth, higher than Britain after Waterloo, far higher than the 90% that was supposed to be the edge of the cliff, far higher than the levels that triggered the Greek catastrophe. Japan crossed every line in this story decades ago and kept right on going. By the logic of the cliff, Japan should be a smoking ruin. By the logic of the trap, Japan should be deep in the room, reaching for the terrible doors, inflating or defaulting, or repressing its people into quiet poverty. And it is not. Japan has carried this colossal debt for years and years, through stagnation, yes, through a long economic malaise, but without the crisis, without the default, without the inflationary collapse, without the spiral. For a long time, Japan even had the opposite problem, deflation, prices falling rather than rising, the precise reverse of the inflationary exit. So either the entire framework I have given you is wrong, or Japan is doing something the framework does not capture, and the truth, the genuinely interesting and genuinely unsettling truth, is the second one. Japan is not exempt from the laws of the trap. Japan has changed the variables that make the trap deadly, and understanding exactly which variables, and exactly how fragile that arrangement is, tells you more about your own country's situation than any amount of staring at the headline ratio. Here is what Japan did differently, and why it matters for everyone. The first thing is who Japan owes the money to. When a country borrows from foreigners, those foreign lenders can flee. At the first sign of trouble, they sell the bonds, pull their money out, send the currency crashing and the interest rate soaring, and the panic feeds on itself, which is the mechanism behind most of the violent crises in this story. But Japan does not owe its debt to foreigners, or mostly does not. The overwhelming majority of Japanese government debt, around 90% of it, is held inside Japan by Japanese banks, Japanese pension funds, Japanese insurance companies, and above all, by the Japanese central bank itself. This is a country that to an extraordinary degree owes the money to itself. And a creditor who is also yourself does not panic and flee, because there is nowhere to flee to and no one to flee from. The Japanese saver has, for cultural and historical reasons, kept enormous amounts of wealth in cash and in domestic bonds, patiently, loyally, for decades, funding their government's debt at rates that would make an American or British investor walk away in disgust. The debt is vast, but it is owed to a captive, patient domestic base that has shown no inclination to run. The second thing is that the Japanese central bank, the Bank of Japan, now owns a staggering share of the government's own debt. As of recent figures, it holds something on the order of 46% of all the government bonds and bills in existence. Nearly half of the entire national debt of Japan is held by an arm of the Japanese state itself, and the interest the government pays on the bonds the central bank holds flows to the central bank and then, in large part, flows straight back to the government as the central bank's profits, which means a huge slice of the terrifying interest bill is, in effect, the government paying itself and getting the money back. This is the kind of arrangement that sounds like a magic trick, like getting something for nothing, and the reason it is not quite a magic trick, the reason it is more like a held breath, is the third thing, and the third thing is the one that is changing right now. The third thing is that Japan kept its interest rates near zero for an extraordinarily long time, lower and longer than any major economy in modern history, which meant that even a debt of 230% of the economy cost almost nothing to carry. This is the part people miss when they look at Japan and conclude that the debt does not matter. The debt did not bite because the interest rate was a whisper, and a vast debt at a whisper of a rate produces a small interest bill, smaller as a share of the economy than the bills carried by countries with far less debt but higher rates. Japan was not exempt from the arithmetic of the trap. Japan had simply set one of the key terms of that arithmetic, the interest rate, to nearly zero, and held it there by force, year after year, decade after decade. And that, finally, is the held breath. Because a country cannot hold its breath forever, and Japan is now, in our moment, beginning to exhale. For most of the last decade, the Bank of Japan did not merely keep rates low. It actively pinned the interest rate on government bonds to the floor through a policy with a forgettable technical name, yield curve control, which meant the central bank stood ready to buy unlimited quantities of bonds to stop their interest rate from rising above a target. It controlled the price of money by brute force. And in 2024, it began to dismantle that policy because the deflation that had defined Japan for a generation finally gave way to inflation, and the central bank could no longer justify holding rates at the floor while prices rose. So the rates have started to climb. The interest on a 10-year Japanese government bond, pinned near zero for years, has risen to its highest level in well over a decade, and every increment of that climb is terrifying in a way it would not be for a less indebted country, precisely because the debt is so enormous. When you owe 230% of your economy, a rise in the interest rate of even 1 or 2 percentage points eventually translates. As the old cheap debt matures and has to be refinanced at the new rates, into an interest bill that begins to consume the budget the way it is already consuming the American one. The held breath is being released slowly, deliberately, with great care, and everyone involved knows that if it is released too fast, the very thing that made Japan the great exception, the low rate on the vast debt, becomes the thing that turns Japan into the great example. Japan did not escape the trap. Japan postponed it, brilliantly and for an unusually long time, and the postponement is now reaching its limit, and the world is watching the most indebted major nation on earth try to climb out of an experiment that no country has ever run before at this scale, with no map, because there is no map. Because nobody has ever been here. So Japan is not a refutation of the trap. Japan is a demonstration of which variables matter, and the variables it reveals are the ones you should be watching in every other country, including your own. Who do you owe it to? Foreigners who can flee, or your own people who cannot? What currency is it in? One you control, or one you do not? And what is the interest rate doing, sleeping or waking? Japan got lucky, or rather Japan got disciplined and homogeneous and patient in a way few societies are, on all three at once, and bought itself decades. It did not buy itself an exemption. There are no exemptions. There is only the postponement, and the price of the postponement, and the fact that the bill, however long deferred, is always, eventually, presented. There are two more honest complications I owe you before we follow this to its end, because they are the strongest remaining arguments that the trap is not as universal as I have made it sound, and you deserve to weigh them yourself. The first is the argument made by a school of thought that says a country which issues its own currency can never truly be forced to default, because it can always create the money to pay. By this logic, a country like the United States or Britain or Japan, which borrows in a currency it alone can print, faces no real solvency limit, only an inflation limit, and the whole framing of running out of money is a category error. There is real truth in this, and it is exactly why the countries that suffered the cleanest, most brutal solvency crises like Greece, were countries that had given up their own currency, Greece having joined the euro, borrowing in a currency it could not print, which is what turned its troubles into a genuine insolvency rather than an inflation problem. The currency issuer does have a power the currency user lacks, but notice what that power actually is. It is not an escape from the trap. It is a guarantee that the exit will be inflation rather than default, that the robbery will take the quiet form rather than the loud one. The power to print is not the power to avoid the cost. It is only the power to choose which of the bad doors you walk through, and to choose the one that falls on your savers rather than your bondholders, which, since your savers are your own citizens, is not the comfort it first appears to be. The second complication is the one that applies most directly to the United States, and it is the genuine privilege of issuing the world's reserve currency. The dollar is the money the entire world uses to trade, to save, to settle its accounts, and that creates a permanent, structural global demand for dollars and for the safe dollar-denominated asset, which is United States government debt. The world needs to hold dollars, so the world keeps buying American bonds, so America can borrow more cheaply, for longer than any other country on earth could possibly get away with. It is a real and enormous advantage, and it is the single best reason to think the United States can carry its rising debt further than the framework would otherwise suggest. But it is not infinite, and it is not guaranteed, and the man who knows the long history of this best, Kenneth Rogoff himself, the chess grandmaster who can see the lost position while the pieces are still on the board, has spent recent years arguing precisely that the dollar's dominance is far from assured, that reserve status is a thing that has belonged to other currencies in other centuries and has always, eventually, moved on. The privilege buys room. It does not repeal the arithmetic, it just raises the ceiling. And a higher ceiling in a trap is still a trap, and the higher the ceiling, the further the fall when you finally reach it. Which brings us, at last, out of the history and the theory, and into the present tense, into the thing that is happening right now, this year, as you listen. Because the reason this old argument has come roaring back from the dead, the reason the spreadsheet joke turned out not to have settled anything, is that several of the largest economies on earth are walking into the room at the same time, and you can watch them do it in real time if you know where to look. Start with France, because France is the clearest case of the trap working through politics rather than through markets alone, and because France is supposed to be a core, stable, founding member of the rich world's inner club, not the sort of country that has debt crises. France carries debt of around 114% of its economy and runs a deficit so far above the European Union's own rules that it has been placed under the bloc's formal procedure for excessive deficits. And France has discovered the political face of the trap, which is this. When a country needs to bring its borrowing under control, but every available cut is hated by some part of the population, and every available tax is hated by another, the government can become quite literally unable to pass a budget. And a government that cannot pass a budget cannot govern. In the autumn of 2025, the French Prime Minister, François Bayrou, staked his government on exactly this, on the need to confront the deficit, and he lost a confidence vote on the 8th of September and his government fell. He was not the first French government to fall over this. He was one of a series, a revolving door of administrations unable to solve a problem that has no solution that anyone will vote for, which is the precise definition of the trap. The room where every door is bad, expressed not as a market panic, but as a parliament that cannot agree on which bad door to open, and so opens none, and so drifts deeper into the room while arguing. And the markets noticed. The interest rate that France has to pay to borrow for 30 years climbed to its highest level since the European sovereign debt crisis of more than a decade ago, the crisis that nearly broke the euro. At certain moments, the rate investors demanded to lend to France rose to converge with, and even at points to exceed, the rates demanded of Italy and of Greece, countries that France has spent its entire modern history regarding as its less disciplined southern neighbours. The market was beginning to look at France and see not a core safe haven, but a country with a chronic, unsolvable fiscal problem, and a political system incapable of addressing it. And the market began, gently for now, to price France accordingly. There is a backstop. The European Central Bank has tools it can deploy to stop a member state's borrowing costs from spiralling, and everyone assumes that if France truly began to fall, those tools would be used. But notice what that means. It means France's safety now depends on a rescue mechanism rather than on France's own solvency, and a country whose safety depends on the promise of rescue is a country that has already, quietly, lost the thing that made it safe. Then there is Britain, which gives us the cleanest recent illustration of how fast the quiet trap can become a loud one when confidence cracks. Britain's debt sits at around 100% of its economy, and its debt interest bill has swollen to something on the order of £110 billion a year, which is roughly double what the country spends on its entire military. Most of the time this expresses itself slowly, as a grinding constraint on every budget, a reason there is never quite enough for anything. But Britain also showed the world, in the most vivid possible way, what the sudden version looks like. In the autumn of 2022, a new government announced a budget of large unfunded tax cuts, and the bond market's reaction was not slow and was not gentle. The interest rate on long-term British government debt rose with terrifying speed, more than a full percentage point in a matter of days, and the violence of the move threatened to detonate the pension system, where complex financial arrangements suddenly required enormous amounts of cash that did not exist. A doom loop in which falling bond prices forced selling that drove prices down further, and the Bank of England had to intervene with emergency force to stop a full collapse. The government that triggered it did not survive. It was the shortest-lived government in British history, brought down in weeks, not by an election, but by the bond market, which had looked at the country's plans and simply refused to fund them. That is the creditor I described at the very beginning, the one that does not vote and does not sleep, casting a vote more decisive than any election and winning. And here is the part that should disturb you about Britain, because the spectacular crisis of 2022 is not actually the frightening bit. The frightening bit came quietly, 3 years later, with no drama at all. By the autumn of 2025, the interest rate on 30-year British government debt had climbed, slowly, without any single triggering event, without any reckless budget, without any panic, to its highest level since 1998. Higher, in fact, than the peak it had briefly touched during the spectacular crisis of 2022. The difference was that this time there was no drama, no emergency intervention, no government falling in a week. Because this time, it did not arrive as a shock. It arrived as a trend. It crept up. And a slow creep is in many ways more ominous than a sudden spike. Because a spike is an accident the market can recover from, while a creep is the market's considered, sober, unpanicked judgment that lending to this country for the long term is simply riskier than it used to be, and that judgment, once formed, does not easily reverse. The loud crisis got the headlines. The quiet creep is the trap. I want to pause here because we are approaching the bottom now, and I want to make sure you see the pattern that connects France and Britain and Japan and the United States, the pattern that the headline ratio was always failing to capture. In none of these countries is the story a clean cliff at a magic number. France at 114, Britain at 100, Japan at 230. The United States climbing past 120 by some measures, and they are all in different kinds of trouble at different numbers, which is exactly what you would expect if the magic threshold was always a myth. But every one of them is exhibiting the same underlying condition, the one the ratio was a crude proxy for all along. The loss of room, the collapse of options, the slow handover of the budget from the elected government to the interest bill. France cannot pass a budget. Britain pays more in interest than in defence, and watches its borrowing cost creep to a 27-year high. Japan holds its breath at the edge of an experiment no one has run. The United States spends more servicing its debt than defending itself, and watches that gap widen every year by the arithmetic of its own budget office. None of them has fallen off a cliff. All of them are in the room. So look hardest at the United States, because it is the largest, because it issues the world's money, because it believes most deeply that it is the exception. And because the exception it believes itself to be is the precise belief that Reinhart and Rogoff spent 800 years of data warning about. This time is different. The American version of that sentence is the reserve currency. The conviction that because the world needs dollars, the normal rules suspend themselves, that America can run deficits no other country could run. Forever, because there will always be a buyer for its debt. And there is truth in it, as I have said. The privilege is real. But listen to the way the smartest people who hold that privilege talk about it now. Because they are not talking the way you talk about something you are sure of. They are talking the way you talk about something you are afraid of losing. The American numbers have crossed from abstract into vertiginous. A deficit running around 6% of the economy in years that are not recessions and not wars, which is to say in ordinary times, when the deficit is supposed to be small or absent so that there is room to expand it when trouble comes. Debt held by the public climbing past the record set at the absolute peak of the Second World War and heading higher, into territory the country has never occupied in peacetime in its entire history. And the interest bill, the engine, the thing at the front of the queue, now the fastest growing major item in the entire federal budget, projected by the country's own non-partisan budget office to reach $1.8 trillion a year within a decade, to keep exceeding the military budget every year from here forward, and to climb as a share of the economy to a level not seen since 1940. These are not the projections of a doom-monger. These are the official baseline projections of the Congressional Budget Office, the government's own accountants, describing the default path, the path the country is on if nothing dramatic changes. And nothing dramatic is changing because nothing dramatic can change. Because every part of the budget that could be cut is defended by someone who will not allow it. And that, the political impossibility, is the American face of the trap. The same trap that toppled the French government, just slower and larger and quieter. The American budget is dominated by a handful of things, and almost all of them are politically untouchable. The great social insurance programs for the old and the sick are the largest single commitments, and they are sacred, defended by the most reliable voters in the country. Expanding automatically as the population ages whether anyone votes for it or not. The military is the next great block, and proposing to cut it is treated as something close to treason. And taxes, the other side of the ledger, the obvious way to close a deficit, are subject to a politics in which raising them is the one thing an American politician can be most reliably destroyed for proposing. So the math is simple, and the politics make the math impossible. You cannot touch the spending, you cannot raise the taxes, the deficit therefore continues, the debt therefore grows, the interest bill therefore swells, and the room, the optionality, the capacity to respond to the next war or pandemic or crash, therefore quietly drains away, year after year. While everyone agrees that something must be done, and no one can agree on anything that could be done, and the budget, the real budget, drifts further out of the hands of the people who are elected to write it, and into the hands of the creditor who sits at the front of the queue and is paid first, always, no matter what. Now follow this where it actually goes, because here is the turn, and it is the turn the whole story has been bending toward. The United States issues its own currency. I told you what that means. It means the country cannot be forced into the loud default that struck Greece, because it can always create the dollars to pay. The bondholder will always get their dollars. What the framework guarantees is not that America will refuse to pay. It is that America, when the room finally runs out, will pay in dollars that are worth less than the dollars it borrowed. The exit available to a currency issuer is not the loud door of default. It is the quiet door. It is inflation, and its even quieter cousin, financial repression. The slow erosion of the value of money held in cash and bonds, the 3 or 4% a year transferred invisibly from savers to the state, the mechanism Reinhart herself documented in the aftermath of the last Great War, the robbery that worked so well precisely because the people it robbed never knew. That is not the speculative doom of the framework. That is the framework's most confident prediction. When a currency-issuing nation runs out of room, it does not default. It debases. It has to. The other doors are closed to it by its own privilege, and the only door its privilege leaves open is the one that opens onto the savings of its own people. And here is the third time I am going to make you look directly at the bottom, because we are nearly there now, and you have had 2 warnings, and this is the last one before the thing itself. The exit the United States is most likely to take. The exit that France and Britain are most likely to take. The exit that Japan is now beginning to take as its long deflation turns to inflation and its rates begin to rise, is not an event. It is not a date. It is not a crash you will see on the news with a headline and a number, the way you saw Greece, the way you saw the British pension scare. It is a condition. It is a long, low, grinding erosion of the value of money, a decade or 2 of inflation running a little hotter than the interest you earn, a quiet tax on everyone who saved, a slow transfer from the careful to the indebted state. And it will not announce itself, and there will be no moment you can point to and say, there, that is when it happened, because it will not happen at a moment. It will happen the way the British 30-year rate crept to a 27-year high, with no drama at all. It will happen the way the overhang episodes in the data ground on for 23 years. It will happen so slowly that you will adjust to it, that you will come to think of it as normal, that you will forget there was ever a time when money you saved held its value while it waited for you. The trap does not close like a jaw, it closes like a tide. I want to come back to the people now, because I promised you at the start that the way Carmen Reinhart learned to count was shaped by something that happened to her when she was 10, and we have arrived at the place where that detail pays off, and it pays off darkly. A 10-year-old girl is told by her frightened parents, as they leave everything behind in Havana, that money can be taken, but education cannot, that wealth is the thing that vanishes, and knowledge is the thing that survives. She grows up and becomes the world's foremost scholar of exactly how the wealth of nations vanishes, of the precise mechanisms by which the savings of careful people are quietly confiscated by states in trouble, and the great irony of her career. The thing that should make the hair on your arms stand up is that her single most famous finding, the 90% number, the one that escaped into the world and did so much damage, was itself an error, a thing taken away from her in public, the way her family's property was taken, exposed by a student she had trusted with her own data. The woman who learned as a child that what you possess can be confiscated had her most prized possession, her most cited result, confiscated in front of the entire world. And the deeper lesson of her own life's work, the lesson that survived the error, the lesson her parents taught her on the way out of Cuba, is the one almost everyone refused to learn from the spreadsheet scandal. They learned that a number was wrong. They did not learn the thing the number was clumsily pointing at, which is the thing her parents knew, which is that what you have saved is never as safe as you believe, and that a state in difficulty will, in the end, reach for it, and that it will tell you, while it does so, that this time is different. And think about Rogoff, the chess grandmaster, the man trained from childhood to recognize the precise moment a game becomes unwinnable, even while every piece is still on the board, even while the losing player is still confidently planning his attack. That skill, the ability to see the lost position early, is the rarest and most valuable thing a chess player can possess. And it is exactly the skill that a country in a debt trap lacks, because the defining feature of the trap, the thing that makes it a trap rather than a cliff, is that it does not look lost from the inside. From the inside, it looks like a game that can still be won. The flag is up. The elections happen. The bonds still sell. The interest still gets paid. Every piece is still on the board. And a grandmaster, looking at the same position, sees that it is already over, that the sequence of moves leading to defeat is forced, that there is no escape even though the escape feels available, even though the losing player is still reaching for it. Rogoff spent his youth learning to see that, and then he spent his career documenting nations that could not see it about themselves. And the privilege of the reserve currency, the thing that is supposed to make America the exception, is in his own recent telling not a permanent advantage, but a temporary one, a thing that has belonged to others and always moved on, which is the Grand Master quietly telling you that he has looked at the board and he does not like the position, however many pieces are still on it. And think, finally, about Thomas Herndon, the graduate student, because his role in this story is the one almost everyone gets exactly backward. The popular memory of Herndon is that he is the man who proved the debt scare was nonsense, who found the Excel error, who exposed the austerity lie and won. That is the comforting version, and it is wrong, and the wrongness of it is the whole tragedy. Herndon did not prove that debt does not matter. He proved that a specific number was calculated incorrectly, which is a smaller and more precise thing, and in the public's hunger for a clean victory, the precise thing got inflated into a sweeping one, and the sweeping false version, debt does not matter, the scare was a lie, we can relax, became the new comfortable story that replaced the old comfortable story, and it is just as dangerous, because it tells you to stop worrying about the one thing you should be worried about. Herndon found a real error, and the world learned the wrong lesson from it, which is, when you think about it, the exact same failure that produced the error in the first place. People believing the comfortable version because the uncomfortable version requires them to keep paying attention. So strip away the comfortable versions, both of them, the cliff and the punchline, and look at what is actually left standing after everything, because what is left standing is small and solid and worse than either. There is no magic number. That is true, and it is settled, and the cliff is gone for good. And there is a trap, real, documented across 8 centuries, operating right now in the largest economies on Earth, and the trap is not a ratio, but a condition. The slow loss of a nation's room to choose, ending in a small set of exits, all of them bad, the worst of them quiet. And the quiet ones, the inflation and the repression, the exits that a currency-issuing nation is most likely to take precisely because its privilege closes the loud doors and leaves only the soft ones open, do not fall on the abstract entity called the state. They fall on people. They fall on the specific behavior of saving money and expecting it to hold its value. They fall on the pension, the bank account, the cash, the bond, the prudent and the careful and the old, and they fall so softly and so slowly that the people they fall on will, in the great majority of cases, never once identify what is happening to them, never once connect the gentle annual erosion of what their savings can buy to a decision made in a finance ministry to deal with a debt by, quietly transferring it onto them. That is the trap, not the number on the slide. Your savings are the denominator that gets adjusted. Your patience is the resource the state is counting on. Your failure to notice is the mechanism's most essential component, because a robbery this slow only works on a victim who does not know to look, and the entire apparatus, the dull name, financial repression, the absence of any law to point to, the absence of any default to report, the gentleness of 3 or 4% a year, exists for one purpose, which is to make sure you never look. There is a sentence that connects every collapse in Reinhart and Rogoff's 800 years of data, and it is the sentence they named the book after. And I have been holding it in reserve for this moment, because it lands hardest here, at the bottom, when you can finally feel the full weight of it. Before the Spanish defaults of the 1500s, before the French collapses that helped feed a revolution, before the Latin American debt crises, before Weimar, before Argentina the first time, and the second and the 9th, before Greece, before the global crisis of 2008, the people in charge looked at their situation and they found reasons, intelligent reasons, well-evidenced reasons, why the pattern that had destroyed everyone before them did not apply to them. This time is different. The financial instruments are more sophisticated now. The central bank understands things the old ones did not. Our institutions are stronger. Our economy has changed its nature. We have learned the lessons of history. And they were always, every single time, in the specific details correct. The instruments really were more sophisticated. The central bankers really did understand more, and it never mattered, because the thing that destroys a nation in debt is not a failure of sophistication. It is the slow arithmetic of compounding interest meeting the hard limit of political will, and that arithmetic does not care how clever you are, and that limit does not move because you are educated, and the lesson of history that every generation believes it has learned is the one lesson that cannot be learned, because the learning of it is precisely the hubris that the next collapse is built on. Count them. The empires that believed their size made them immune. the republics that believed their virtue made them different. The reserve currencies that believed the world's need for them was permanent, the Dutch guilder before the pound before the dollar, each in its turn the indispensable money of the world. Each in its turn convinced that its indispensability was a law of nature rather than a phase of history, each in its turn watching that status drift away to a successor that believed the same thing about itself. The pattern is not subtle. The pattern is the most consistent finding in the entire history of money. And the United States today, and France today, and Britain today, and Japan today, are all, in their different ways and at their different numbers, saying the same thing the Dutch said, and the Spanish said, and the Argentines said 9 separate times. Not in those words. Never in those words. The words are always about sophistication and privilege, and the lessons learned. But underneath the words is the same belief. The belief that the room they are standing in is not the room. That the doors they can see are not the only doors. That for them, uniquely, in all of history, there will turn out to be a fifth exit that no nation before them ever found. There is no fifth exit. There has never been a fifth exit. In 8 centuries of the most exhaustive record anyone has ever assembled, the exits are inflation, default, repression, and the once-in-a-history stroke of luck that was Britain after Waterloo, peace and supremacy and growth and trust all at once for 100 years, a hand of cards that is not going to be dealt again. And the reason this should disturb you, specifically you sitting wherever you are sitting, is that you have spent this entire time perhaps imagining that this is a story about governments, about economists, about institutions and ministers and the abstract machinery of national finance, and it is not. It was never that. Every mechanism in this story terminates in a household. The inflation that dissolves the debt dissolves the savings of a family. The repression that liquidates the debt at 3 or 4% a year liquidates it out of the bank accounts of people who were told that saving was the responsible thing to do. The default that wipes the slate clean wipes out the pension fund that held the bonds. The austerity that was supposed to fix it all closed the ward where someone's mother was waiting for treatment. There is no version of the exit from a debt trap that does not, in the end, reach into the life of an ordinary person who had no part in creating the debt and no vote on the manner of its resolution, and, in most cases, no idea that any of it was happening to them at all. The state does not suffer. The state is an abstraction. The suffering is always, only, ever distributed downward and outward, onto the people least able to see it coming, and least able to protect themselves from it once it arrives. So when you hear, in the months and years ahead, that the debt is under control, that the situation is stable, that the experts have it in hand, that this time, for these reasons, in this country, it is different, I want you to remember the shape of what you now know. Not the cliff, which was never real, not the punchline, which was never the point. The room. The narrowing of choices. The interest bill moving to the front of the queue and staying there. The slow handover of the budget from the people you elected to the creditor who is paid first. And the quiet exit. The soft door. The one that opens onto your own savings. The one that the privilege of a great reserve currency does not protect you from, but in fact guarantees, because it closes every door except that one. And here is the part that should make you angry. The part that the spreadsheet joke let everyone skip past, because it is less fun than laughing at an Excel error. After all of it, after the 8 centuries of data, and the famous paper, and the error, and the correction, and the careful follow-up studies, the people whose entire profession is to answer the question, how much debt is too much, cannot answer it. They do not agree. The International Monetary Fund, which used the 90% logic to impose austerity on Greece, later published its own work saying there is no magic threshold, which is the institution quietly contradicting the policy it had already enforced on millions of people, after the enforcement was complete, after the wards had closed, with no apology attached and no reversal of anything that had been done. The economists who provided the intellectual cover for austerity faced no real consequence. Their careers continued, their reputations, after a bruising year, largely recovered. Reinhart became the chief economist of the World Bank. Rogoff kept his chair at Harvard and went on writing influential books. The graduate student who found the error became briefly famous and then went back to being an economist. And the generation of young Greeks and Spaniards who spent the formative years of their working lives locked out of employment, the families who lost access to healthcare, the people whose pensions were cut, received nothing, no restitution, no acknowledgement that the conclusive empirical evidence used to justify their suffering had been, in significant part, a formula dragged to the wrong cell in a spreadsheet. That is the abdication at the heart of this, and it is not a conspiracy, and I am not asking you to believe in one. It is something more ordinary and more frightening than a conspiracy. It is a system in which the people with the authority to reshape millions of lives are not, in any meaningful sense, accountable for being wrong. In which the cost of their errors is paid entirely by people they will never meet, and in which the discovery that they were wrong changes nothing about the damage already done, and almost nothing about how the next decision will be made. And I do not think this is hypothetical for you, and this is the last thing I will say before the end, because I suspect that some of what I have described you have already begun to feel, even if you did not have a name for it. The years since the last great crisis have not been kind to money that sits still. Prices have risen faster than the savings of ordinary people have grown. The cash in the account buys less than it did. The wage that felt adequate a few years ago feels thin now, and the gap between what things cost and what you earn has widened in a way that is hard to point at and impossible to vote against, because no one passed a law to create it, and no one will pass a law to reverse it. I am not going to tell you that this is definitely the mechanism I described, because the honest answer is that inflation has many causes, and untangling them is genuinely hard, and I will not pretend to a certainty the evidence does not support. But I will tell you that the experience of watching your money quietly lose its value, while the official numbers insist everything is fine, is not a new experience in history. It is the most common experience in the entire history of nations in debt. It is what financial repression feels like from the inside, which is to say it feels like almost nothing, like a vague unease, like the suspicion that you are working harder for less and being told you are imagining it. That feeling is the trap, experienced at the only scale any of us ever actually experiences it, which is the scale of a single life trying to hold on to a little security in a system that has quietly decided your security is a resource it can spend. I have been calling it a creditor that does not vote and does not sleep and never forgets, and I want to end by being precise about what that creditor actually is, because it is not the dramatic thing you might be picturing. It is not a foreign power. It is not a shadowy cabal of bankers. It is not even really the people who hold the bonds, though they are the ones who get paid. The creditor is the arithmetic itself. It is the simple, indifferent fact that compounding interest grows whether or not the economy does, whether or not the politics allow a response, whether or not anyone is paying attention. The debt accrues interest in the night while the country sleeps. It accrues interest during the election in which no candidate will discuss it. It accrues interest through the crisis that demands new borrowing, and through the recovery that never quite generates enough growth to catch up. It is the one participant in the national life that is never on holiday, never up for re-election. Never persuaded by an argument, never moved by a hardship. It simply compounds. And a society that has handed its budget to that participant has handed it to something that cannot be reasoned with and cannot be voted out, and the handover happens not in a single dramatic act of surrender, but in 10,000 small deferrals, each one reasonable, each one defensible, each one a decision to deal with the problem later, until later arrives and the room has closed around them and the only doors left are the bad ones. The math does not name the date. I need you to hear that clearly, because it is the one honest thing that can be said about timing, and everyone who tells you otherwise in either direction is guessing. The people who tell you the crisis is coming next year are guessing. The people who tell you it will never come because this time is different are guessing. The math does not work like that. The math does not produce a date. Japan has shown that the date can be deferred for decades by a country with a captive lender and a patient people and the discipline to hold its rates at the floor. Britain after Waterloo showed that the trap can be escaped entirely by a country lucky enough to hold the winning hand for a century. The math does not name the date, and it does not promise the catastrophe. What the math names is the trap. It names the room. It names the narrowing. It names the small set of exits, and the fact that the longer you wait, the worse they get, and the fewer of them remain. It tells you the structure of the situation with perfect confidence, and it tells you nothing at all about the timing, which means you cannot prepare for it the way you prepare for a thing with a date. And that, the absence of a date, is not a reprieve. It is the cruelest part. Because a thing with a date can be braced for. A thing without one just erodes you while you wait, and teaches you, year by year, to stop waiting, to stop watching, to accept the slow loss as the normal weather of a normal life. Go back, one last time, to the spreadsheet, to the formula that stopped 5 rows short, because there is a final irony in it that I have been saving, and it is the darkest one. The error made the danger look worse than it was. It drew a cliff that did not exist. It turned a slow grinding drag into a sudden death, and when the error was corrected, the danger was revealed to be milder than the cliff suggested, more gradual, more survivable, and the world exhaled and relaxed. But a slow grinding drag that runs for 23 years and erodes a generation's wealth through a tax it cannot see is not milder than a cliff. It is worse than a cliff. Because a cliff at least announces itself, a cliff at least gives you an edge to see and a moment to choose, and the thing that is actually happening, the thing the corrected data revealed, gives you no edge and no moment and no announcement at all. The error, by drawing the cliff, accidentally told the truth about the severity while lying about the shape, and the correction, by erasing the cliff, accidentally lied about the severity while telling the truth about the shape. And the world, offered a choice between 2 partial truths, chose the comfortable one, the one that let it stop paying attention, which is the choice it makes every single time, which is the choice that is being made about your future right now, in finance ministries and budget committees and central banks, by intelligent and well-meaning people who have looked at the situation and concluded, for reasons they can defend, that this time is different. It is not different. It is never different. That is the only finding in this entire story that has survived every error and every correction and 800 years of the cleverest people alive insisting otherwise. The instruments change, the numbers change, the flags change, the faces of the economists change. The one thing that does not change is the room, and the doors, and the fact that the bill, however long it is deferred, however quietly it is eventually collected, is always, in the end, paid by the people who were never asked, and never told, and never knew to look. You know to look now. That is the only thing this can give you, and it is a smaller gift than you might want, because knowing does not let you out of the room. You are a citizen of one of these countries, almost certainly, and the room closed around it long before you understood any of this, and there is no individual exit, no clever trick, no place to stand inside a national economy where the slow tide of a debased currency cannot reach you. Knowing does not save your savings. It only saves you from the particular indignity of being robbed without ever understanding that it happened, of going to your grave believing that the gentle annual shrinking of what your money could buy was just the way of things, just the weather, just life, rather than what it actually was, which was a decision made on your behalf. To deal with a debt you did not create by quietly taking it out of you. The ratio was never the danger. The number on the slide was never the danger. The danger was always the room, and the doors, and the slow handover, and the soft exit aimed at the careful. Several of the largest economies on earth are deep inside that room right now. They crossed no single line to get there, because there is no single line. They walked in slowly, over years, each step defensible, each deferral reasonable, until the doors behind them closed, and the only doors ahead were the ones that open onto you. The math does not name the date, it names the trap. And you are standing in it.